Hi everyone. Today we are going to talk about what I guess I'm calling ethical consumerism, but there's all sorts of things that you could call it. It's a charitable business model, it's responsible corporate governance. There's all sorts of things you can call it. But what we're looking at is ways of combining charity and business. Or another way to put it is trying to harness the power of business or capitalism in order to generate better or more moral outcomes for different people. Okay? So, standardly, sort of the virtue and the vice of capitalism, it's pretty standard to say that the virtue and the vice of capitalism is that it's driven by personal self-interest, so not necessarily greed or harm to others or hatred of others or anything like that, but just, hey, you're selling something because you want to make a profit, right? Doesn't mean you hate people. It doesn't mean you're trying to screw over the person you're selling stuff to, but what's the bottom motive? What is the central point of buying and selling things without which no one would ever buy or sell stuff? Well, making some money. Like we always say, you don't go into work because you love your boss so much. You go in, at least mainly, to get paid. And as much as you might like other things about your job, if you took away the pay, you probably wouldn't go in anymore. It's not true for me. I love my job, but most people's jobs work that way. Okay. Now that's said to be the virtue and the vice because what it means is that, hey, you get paid. That's good. It also means that you do work for someone else or provide some sort of good or service that they want. In fact, they want it so much they're willing to pay for it. So part of the virtue of capitalism is said to be, everybody wins, right? The buyer and the seller win. But commonly it's said that this is also the vice of it because you're not motivated by other concerns. You're not motivated by doing good through your job. You're motivated by getting paid. Now, once more, rarely do people think that this means that what capitalism means is like burning villages to the ground for a single penny. It's just, once more, we look at what's the basic motive of your job. Not to do good for other people, but to get a paycheck. Right? So, what's happening more and more nowadays is this really interesting shift where it's not the opposite of this standard model, which says that the virtue of capitalism is that you benefit, buyer and seller both benefit, and that it drives innovation and efficiency and all these other good things. But that also, that's not really directed at doing good. So if your profit doesn't really benefit the world, well, that's the downside of capitalism. But what we get now is, like I said, not so much a reversal of that or a denial of that, but making it more complicated. Ideally, this new way of responsible corporate governance or ethical consumerism or maximizing the good through business ventures, ideally what it does is it's going to find ways that do more good for the community than standard capitalism, but also at the same time make the same or higher even levels of profit. So the most basic way to put this would be, if Starbucks is already selling coffee, and that's just normal capitalism, they make money because they're selling $5 pumpkin spice lattes, and you get the joy of having, a Frappuccino during the summer, win-win. But that's not, it doesn't solve poverty. It doesn't get rid of homelessness. That's fine. That's the old model of capitalism. It's got its pros and its cons. And then ideally, though, the twist is that, as Starbucks actually does, they say, wait a second. If we can tie somehow the coffee we sell to, say, benefiting coffee farmers, then we'll probably pull more customers in or charge a higher price for our coffee. We'll make the same or more money, and these other people, farmers in this case, benefit more. So the business model capitalism is preserved, profit and pleasure for seller and buyer alike. But then if you tweak it a little bit, you might be able to get some extra good stuff that capitalism normally doesn't get by achieving some community-based good on the other hand. Now that's the sweet spot, right? That preserves the virtues of capitalism while avoiding the vices or the shortcomings. Okay? So, for today's class, I'm going to give you 3 different examples. Okay? We're going to do the coffee farmers, that longer article we did. We're going to use the example of Tom's shoes. And we're going to use the example of Heifer International, which strictly is not a business, but you'll see why it fits in. Okay? Now what I want, this is the first discussion question before we even get to the reading, is I want your examples of attempts to harness business practices to do moral good or community uplift. Okay? So what wouldn't work here, this is going to be pretty open-ended, but what would not work here is to say something like, oh, Ford Motors, because they make cars and people want cars. Because you see, that's good, but that's just the normal capitalist model of giving people what they want. Something more has to happen for it to be this new wrinkle or new twist. So if Ford, for every Ford Focus purchased, planted a tree, that would be more like what we're talking about. Okay? So I want your examples of businesses sort of acting like charities, or, same thing, charities sort of acting like businesses. Now here's the thing. Like the Tom's example shows us, the Tom Shoes example shows us, some of these do a better job of it than others. Okay? So I will, in the recording today, and I expect that some of you will do in your examples, will point out an example and then go, yeah, but it doesn't really do what it says it does, or it does it but really inefficiently, or it does it but there's a better way. So the way I like to teach this material is that when it works, when this idea works of making businesses sort of like charities and charities sort of like businesses, or using the power of capitalism to do more than capitalism can normally do, when it works well, oh man, it's the sweet spot. Like I said, it's the best of all possible worlds. On the other hand, there's no guarantee that it works perfectly every time. And frankly, I'll be sort of blunt and cynical here. Sometimes these are just new marketing schemes. They're just ways to get new customers, and they don't actually deliver on the promises of doing more than normal buying and selling stuff. So I want examples from you, but feel free to say, hey, this one's a scam, right? Or this one just tries to make us feel better but doesn't actually do anything. Give me the good and the bad. So once more, the question's simple. Give me examples of businesses that you think do good, that try to go beyond buying and selling to achieve some other sort of moral good. And feel free to say why the example you gave is either so good or why it falls short of the promise a little bit. Okay, so now on to the coffee reading, which is the more detailed of our readings. Okay, little bit of backstory. Not too long ago, there was a glut, that is an oversupply, in the international supply of coffee beans. Now, what happened in this case is that farmers in Ethiopia were hit particularly hard by this. It was basically an economic crisis that deeply affected the whole country, So in normal, we might say classic or pure capitalism, this would be really strongly free market attitudes. You just say, well, we genuinely feel bad for the Ethiopian coffee farmers. I'll metaphorically say that they're starving. I mean, they're not all starving, but that they're struggling to make ends meet. So pure capitalism would say, hey, we genuinely feel bad for the starving farmers, but that's the way markets work. Some years you're a winner and some years you're a loser. And we can't intervene in the markets and, throw money, for instance, at the coffee farmers or demand that people pay them more money. You just have to let the market sort itself out. And you hear this kind of language a lot in Silicon Valley today, right? Where they say, well, capitalism is inherently disruptive. So Uber is going to drive cabbies out of business, and driverless cars are going to drive truckers out of business. We feel bad for those people, but the market will fix itself. These people will find some other job. They'll figure it out. Okay? So, a few things about that before I add a little more detail to this scenario. First is, while that response is completely legitimate from sort of an economic standpoint, it's not very interesting as an ethical standpoint. I'm not saying it's necessarily immoral. I'm just saying if that were our ethical response, oh, there's a crisis, what should we do? And the answer was, we do nothing. It would make for a very short class today, wouldn't it? Okay? Now, our authors, Lee and Lee, it's a father-daughter duo writing this article. It's a chapter from a book. They also think that that's not really moral, but I don't want to project into that too far just yet. We'll just say it's not a very interesting class day if we just say, let it ride. Like, let the market do whatever. Because then in response to what should we do, we just say we should do nothing. Okay? They also think, as I'm saying, a little sharper of a response is that it's actually immoral to do nothing because there's people suffering here. You at least have to engage somehow. Okay? That's one cluster of ideas right there. Second one is this. What did the Ethiopian coffee farmers do when the market fell out? Basically, they couldn't sell their product above cost, right? It would cost them money to go to market and sell it. They'd lose money effectively. Well, they did just what pure market capitalism predicts they would do. They move into some other job where they can make more money. But do you remember from the reading what the other job was? Yeah, they started growing and selling narcotics. You see this in Afghanistan too. There aren't a whole lot of industries available to Afghanis, especially after years of war. Well, it's very easy to grow opium in Afghanistan, and you have to feed your family. Again, capitalism says we put morality aside, and we move, buyers and sellers move to wherever the most profit is. If opium or cat is what it's called, this other narcotic, are where the profit lies, rational actors, rational buyers and sellers will move to where the profit is. Okay? So, at another moral level, we don't really want these people having to grow drugs to make a living. We don't really want those drugs showing up in our communities. So again, something should be done. Okay. A little more detail here to bring home why this can be an ethical question and is not merely an economic question separate from morality. One point to acknowledge is this. This is not the Ethiopian farmer's fault. So if you look closely at what the article says, and if you think about supply and demand, the farmers did nothing wrong here. The only reason there's an oversupply, and the oversupply is what leads to the low prices, the only reason there's an oversupply is actually because the Ethiopian farmers did really well that year. They successfully farmed and got lots and lots of coffee beans. right? So they actually did a good job as workers that year. And just, that's the way the market works sometimes. When everybody else does a good job that year too, you have, to speak really simplistically, if there's twice as many coffee beans on the market one year, because people did twice as good of a job and so there's twice the supply, the price will be half. The details always work out differently, but that's called the law of supply and demand. Higher demand is, the higher the price. Higher supply is, the lower the price. Okay? The point here is, though, it's not that the farmers made a mistake. It's not that they did something wrong. This situation was forced on them from without. So that's one reason it's a moral issue. If it was something that they screwed up for and then were suffering for later, sorry, not my problem, right? That's their fault. But they're not really at fault here. Another way to sort of twist it and make sure we see that it's ethical is raise your hand if you drink coffee. There's literally a coffee mug, an empty coffee mug in front of me right now. So this is another thing, and this is why we think about issues of globalism and how the whole world is interconnected now. There was a point in history when almost no one drank coffee because it was only grown in Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia. Just a few places grew coffee and knew how to make coffee. Then what happens is Europe expands into Asia, into Africa, into the Americas. It starts growing coffee in, say, Mexico, where it was not originally grown. Now Mexico exports coffee to the United States, so does Ethiopia, etc. So here's the point, is that you live in a global marketplace now. While you may not be exactly responsible for everything that happens to Ethiopian coffee farmers, for instance, if a civil war breaks out in Ethiopia, I don't think it's your moral duty to go in like Arnold Schwarzenegger and, solve the civil war. But if you're a coffee drinker, you're at least somehow implicated in this issue. Not that it's your fault, okay? I'm not trying to make anyone feel guilty. But if you're buying coffee and they're selling coffee, there's somehow already some relationship between you and them. Our goal is to try to figure out what that relationship is. Okay. So, it does appear to be a moral issue, not purely an economic issue, and it seems to be one that involves you and I if we drink coffee. And if you don't drink coffee, think about sweatshops, think about child laborers in other countries, etc., etc. Okay. So, there's lots of ways to try to address this problem. One would just be charity. Oh, they're starving. We better throw a bunch of money at it. Okay, that's one possible response. But it's not what we're doing here. There's a second possible response. This is the section I told you to skip in the reading. And that's to try to get governments to work out trade treaties. That's also not the approach we're taking here. The approach is this. If the market caused the problem, that is, if oversupply led to reduced prices, which led to farmers not being able to sell their products, that's a market problem. If the market generated certain ethical problems for us, maybe the market can solve its own problems. Right? So the response we're going to focus on now is when the market makes moral issues and moral problems for us, maybe we can harness the power of the market to solve those same problems. So instead of going completely outside of markets and capitalism, say going to charity or going to government treaties, what if inside the same system we could fix the problems using the tools already available to us? So that's the first response, and I need you to see how this is different from the other response we'll do in a moment. What we're going to talk about now is harnessing purely economic business tools for moral purposes. Okay? And the first one, the one that's most clearly a business tool used for moral purposes, is trademarking. Okay, that's the one we'll talk about first. Now, you all know what a trademark is. Okay, Samsung is a trademark. Apple is a trademark, right? They're often their names, and the names connote a certain kind of product and usually a certain quality of product. So if a car is Mercedes-Benz, that's a registered trademark, and it implies that it's worth the extra money, right? Okay, so you can see the way I've described it so far that trademarks are purely a business strategy. If you want people to think sleek design and high quality, you slap an Apple trademark on it. If you want people to think inexpensive and good bargain for the money, you slap a different trademark on it. It's the low quality but inexpensive laptop that I have. Okay? And you all know how those work. You should be thinking, though, hey, ethics professor, there's nothing ethical about that so far. Macs are nice computers. That's not moral, immoral. It's indifferent to morality. Here's the twist. If you can find a kind of Ethiopian coffee that can be trademarked in the way that, say, Apple and Mercedes-Benz are trademarked, that is, if you can find an Ethiopian coffee that you can trademark as a sign of higher quality, what do higher quality trademarks bring in? Higher profit. More money. Now remember here, the ethical problem is the Ethiopian farmers can't get enough money when they sell their coffee beans. The coffee beans are worth less than it costs to make them. So if we can bring up the cost of certain Ethiopian coffee beans, we avoid the ethical problem of metaphorically starving farmers, because now they're not starving. They made a profit again. So Apple and Mercedes-Benz trademarks would not be fulfilling that same moral function because Apple stockholders are not starving. It's in the specific case, the specific use we make here, that now we do bigger than capitalism results, moral purposes in a way that Mercedes-Benz and Apple trademarks don't do moral work for us. So a little detail here, okay? First, there are, in fact, examples of just this sort of trademarking, basically upping the value or the profit margins of consumer goods. So, for agriculture, where you grow something makes a big difference. Maybe you all aren't into wine yet, because that's something that happens later, if it happens at all, but you've at least heard people talk about wine this way. There are certain wines that only grow in one place in the world. And if you try to grow them somewhere else, they're gross. Or they're at least not the same high quality. So, the example in the text is Chianti wines. It is literally impossible to grow Chianti wines that taste that way and that good anywhere else in the world. And an example that more people know, although it'll still be news to some of you, is that strictly for a wine to be called champagne, it has to be from the Champagne region of France. So white sparkling wine that's from Italy is called Prosecco. If it's from California, it's just called sparkling white. I don't know. Okay? And the reason why is that the Champagne region of France has trademarked that area. It's called a designated controlled zone, something like that. And basically what it means is since the best sparkling white wine comes from the Champagne region, only they are allowed to call it champagne. And that trademark, because trademarks mean only these people are allowed to call their product by that trademark, That trademark guarantees the consumer that if you like this kind of wine, we guarantee you that you should pay extra for it because you're going to like what we have inside the bottle. Chianti is the same way. If you like that style of wine, you're going to be willing to pay more for it, right? That means more money for the producers. You're only going to be willing to pay for it, though, if the trademark is a genuine signal of A, quality, and B, uniqueness to that region. Add all that stuff up together. There are Ethiopian coffee beans, which you cannot grow anywhere else, and if you try, they don't taste good. One of them is called Yurga Chefa. I've had it before. It's really, really good. And so here's the thing. The way this trademark works is consumers are still given 100% their freedom. This is why it's better than government trade deals and why it's better than charity. You as a consumer are still given your freedom. If you want to pay the same low prices and drink cheap Ethiopian coffee beans, you're allowed to do that. But now through the trademark, you're actually given an extra option. Now you can get this fancy Yurga Chefa coffee, as well as Sidamo and these other fancy trademarks. And if you choose to, you can pay more for something that you want more. You see, it's just luxury items applied to morality. You don't have to buy it, so your freedom as a consumer is preserved. If you want it, though, you now have a new option, which is more choice, actually. And if you want it, if you're a coffee snob, then you can pay more and get more at the same time. That's what luxury is, right? Paying more on purpose to get more. Okay. Remember, too, the ethical payoff is farmers that couldn't feed their families before are now more likely to be able to feed their families. You see what I'm saying? That sounds like the sweet spot to me. Nobody's forced to buy any coffee they don't want to. People are actually given more options because this coffee was sort of developed and brought to market in a way it hadn't been before it was trademarked. The coffee farmers make more money. You get better coffee. I'm thinking that's the best of both worlds. Okay, so we'll do a quick pause here. Quick question. Can you think of any problems, any shortcomings with this approach? Is there anything missing, any problem with trademarks as a market solution to a market problem? So pause and think about that. Okay. We now have the next example. And the next one is cooperatives. So once more, this is purely inside the market. This is not going to government for help. This is not going to charity for help. It's using techniques and methods that businesses already use. It's just using them to try to get normal business benefits and extra benefits, moral benefits as well. Okay. So in the same way that supply and demand were the sort of economic principle we harnessed before, the economic power of supply and demand, now we're going to harness that economic power of the size of a business. So part of the reason why Ethiopian coffee farmers were hit particularly hard is because in Ethiopia, most of the coffee is grown at the scale of small family farms. So, 6 or 7 people. In Brazil, they're giant plantations, so they're big businesses there. That's the difference. So Brazil could weather the storm of low prices better than the single farmer families. So, in business, all other things being equal, if you have a company in a contract dealing with another company in a contract, so buyer and seller, and let's say in this case the buyer is a much, much bigger company than is the seller, the buyer inherently has an advantage in that relationship. Now, it doesn't mean they're evil and abusive and, slave masters. It just means if you've got a giant buyer and a small seller, the contract is going to come out more in favor of the giant business, the giant buyer. Okay? So here, I'm skipping things a bit, going a little fast, but you'll see the point. If you've literally got Starbucks or Nestle, which are two of the biggest buyer of coffee beans, they're huge companies. And you literally have an Ethiopian farmer who is a business of, 7 people, this family. And they're negotiating prices for the coffee beans. Who do you think is going to get a price closer to what they want to pay? Obviously, the bigger business. Now, this isn't evil. This is just the way capitalism works. However, remember, we want to do something a little bit more than what capitalism can do here to try to help out these starving farmers. So think about it. If the size of Starbucks and Nestle is what's making this sort of imbalance, it's making it an unbalanced playing field, how would we remedy that? I'm telling you, it doesn't sound like we're doing philosophy here, right? It doesn't sound like we're doing philosophy and ethics, but you isolate a problem, you see what causes the problem, here its size, that can help you figure out rationally, philosophically, logically, how to solve that same problem. This is actually why philosophy is tremendously useful, even for business, and hopefully that'll become clear by the time our class is over. Anyways, we've isolated the cause of the unbalanced contract. It's the size of Nestle and Starbucks. So how do we fix that? How about we make the size more equal? Let's take the seller in this case, which is the coffee bean producer. Let's make it bigger. That's called cooperatives. Literally, one farming family cooperates with another one, and they cooperate with another one. And now the seller of beans, instead of being 7 people, one family, is 700 people of 100 families. They basically put all their coffee beans together, and they take them to market, and they say, hey, Starbucks and Nestle, we have 700 pounds of coffee beans to sell instead of 1. Or 7, whatever. I'm making up numbers here. Now, Starbucks and Nestle can still walk away if they can't afford the price. But the price is now going to be a little more balanced. It's going to be somewhere in between what Starbucks wants to pay and what the coffee bean sellers want to charge. It'll be more in the middle. Whereas before, Starbucks versus a family of 7, it's going to be so close to what Starbucks wants to pay and so far from what the family wants to charge. Now, once more, business freedom is preserved here. Nestle and Starbucks can walk away if they simply can't afford the price. But there's still the same coffee beans for sale, and it'll be somewhere in the middle, and so we're back to a win-win situation instead of a win sort of lose situation. Same question as last time. Can you see any potential problems with that? Can you see any shortcomings? Is there anything unethical about that so far? Okay? Pause and reflect on that. Okay. So here's my response of potential problems. The biggest overarching problem is this, and this is something I want echoing in the background all day today. So far I've been talking in pretty rosy terms. Oh, it's the sweet spot. If you can get business to do this, we preserve all the benefits of capitalism and business, no new downsides and only benefits. Sounds great. Win-win, profit for everybody. Here's my biggest meta issue, the biggest background issue to this. This takes moral questions and reduces them not to what can I do as an individual, but what can I make the impersonal market do? Maybe this won't make sense, but it's like saying, well, there's starving farmers in Ethiopia. What should I do? I should harness weather to make sure that they can grow more coffee, make more money. Or the solution will be if the weather changes and they get more, the market improves. Instead of saying, what can I do to improve the lives of others, it basically says, how about we mobilize something other than me? Trademarks, cooperatives, Nestle's self-interest, right? The desire for luxury coffee. And let's let those things do the moral work for me. So this point will either sort of click or it won't. And if it doesn't, just ask me to say more in email or in the discussion board. Basically what I'm saying is when we're confronted with a moral problem, this approach doesn't go for a personal moral investment in the issue at all. It lets the market, which is not a person, it's not you, it lets the market do all the moral heavy lifting for you. It seems like sort of a cop-out. Instead of you doing something, it just says, oh, we'll get some people to tinker with business models, and then I could ignore the problem. It's poof, it's gone away. Now, I know that sounds sort of cynical, but also, I don't know, imagine some other moral problem. If someone's answer every time to the moral problem was, well, let's change the business model a little bit, you might think that they had a very limited notion of what counts as a moral response. Now, zooming back in, going a little closer to the attitude that I took before, we can say, okay, there's still businessy problems with these business solutions. The first one is this. For trademarks, if you sell coffee or wine or chocolate or truffles, you can do this. Right? This is the farmer's market model. If you grow something agriculturally, you can probably trademark it and do this markup. What if your job is to manufacture shoelaces? Or what if you grow potatoes and the market falls out? You can trademark your potatoes as Idaho, spuds. I don't think that's making a whole lot of money. It's not going to avert or prevent an economic crisis, right? So the thing is, more generally, think about sweatshops. Trademarking is simply not an option to help lift those people out of poverty. If the closer trademark, it won't affect their bottom line pay. If you trademark a potato, you're not going to market up the prices, okay? So you can't make a luxury item out of everything. There's no such thing as luxury shoelaces. So for those kinds of people, this presents no sort of option whatsoever. Okay? Here's another possible problem with co-ops this time. Do co-ops remind you of anything? Do they sound like something else that happens in business? Because they should sound a lot like unions to you. So I'll just leave this as a sort of statement. Some people love unions and some people hate unions. There's all these issues, for instance, around so-called right to work laws. Do you have to join a union? Can your bosses put pressure on you to either join or not join a union, etc.? But when I lived in Philadelphia before, there were unions there, and they exerted a lot of pressure on people to do whatever they wanted. There's an example of what was at the time the tallest tower built in the city of Philadelphia, pretty tall tower. The people making the tower wanted to install low water usage urinals in the men's restroom. So they use next to no water, it saves water, yay for the environment, etc. But the pipe fitters union said, we don't want to put those in because there won't be as many jobs for us in the future. And the builders of the building said, okay, that's true, but it's our building. We're allowed to build it however we want. So what the pipe fitters union did is they said, we'll go on strike and not help you build this building. And if you use outside laborers, non-union laborers to put this in, we'll protest your building as anti-worker, anti-family, scab labor, etc. and you'll get all this bad publicity. So the compromise solution, you have to see me putting up scare quotes around compromise solution here, was the agreement was that the steam fitters, the pipe fitters would put in the low water usage toilets, but they would also get paid extra to install normal water pipes that didn't go anywhere, that didn't connect to any toilets. This is like a bridge to nowhere. That they would get paid to install something that was useless and would never be used so that they could get paid more money now. Now, to me, that seems like a union going way too far. That seems like a union, instead of growing bigger to give the worker a fair say, now it seems like the union is just the new Starbucks in our earlier example. Now they're the behemoth that's so big that it can make everyone else do what it wants at their own expense. At the expense of others. So that's a potential problem with cooperatives, is that they may get so big that pretty soon maybe it's the coffee bean sellers, the farmers, who would then be sort of abusing their power in the marketplace. Maybe then the coffee bean prices would go up so high that you and I can't afford to drink coffee anymore. Those are three problems I see. One specific to trademarks, one specific to co-ops, and the first one was the general one where it's like, well, even when they work, I'm not going to give you moral credit for saving farmers if you're letting luxury brands do all the moral work for you. Okay, so we're going to stop the recording here, partly because it's been going on for about 40 minutes, but also partly I want you to see the difference between what we've just talked about and the difference in what's coming next. They seem identical, but they each have the same two parts, but the order and the priority is reversed. So I just want to say, put in your notes now a big fat line. Trademarks and co-ops are business solutions to business problems, or market solutions to ethical problems caused by the functioning of markets. And what we're going to have next is different. So it should occupy a different part of your notes. Okay, thank you everyone.